everyone, welcome back to Cars and Kelley. Today I'm going to be talking about something that I've put a lot of thought into and that may be interesting to anyone considering buying a Miata, and that is which specific model to buy, which year, which generation, which model. There's a lot of options, so I just wanted to go over all the different choices. So the thing about the Miata is, for the most part, any choice you make will be a good one, because there are so many good model years, and a lot of them are very similar, and so you're not going to lose or gain a whole lot by choosing one over the other. But there are a fair amount of differences, so I just wanted to go over those. So obviously the first thing to consider when thinking about which Miata is your budget, and normally you can get any of the first or second generation models, or not any, but those older Miatas are generally in the price range of $5,000 or less, hopefully a lot less, depending on what you find. But if you're willing to spend more than $5,000 and you want something newer, you could look at the third generation Miata, or maybe even the newest one. But in general, usually when people talk about buying a Miata just to have, as maybe a second car or a project car or just something to work on or learn how cars work and stuff, they're referring to the older Miatas, so the first or second generation. So because of that, and also because it's primarily what I know about most, I'll be talking just about the first and second generation Miatas, which went from 1990 all the way up to 2005. So the first generation is codenamed the NA, and it went from 1990 to 1997, so a 7-year model run. And then there was a gap year of 1998, and the NB went from 99 up to 2005. And there were a few mid-cycle refreshes that I'll talk about, but for the most part, the first generation was similar from 90 to 97, and the second was similar from 99 to 2005. And actually, both of these generations, so all of these cars, share a lot of the same mechanical parts. So a lot of the differences you're going to find are not mechanical or at the core of the car, but more smaller details about each year. So starting off with the NA, the first generation, what are the appeals of the first generation? And this is actually what I thought I was going to be getting for a while. I was looking at first generation Miatas because they're just the most Miata, you could say. They are the essence of what the car is about, light, not much power, just nimble, agile, very simple, and that's really what the first car embodies 100%. It's extremely light. It's only a little over 2,000 pounds. It has a very small motor. The first very original Miatas had a very small motor, and then they increased the size of it a little later. But in general, the first generation was, really what the Miata was all about in terms of simplistic, just a roadster that you didn't have to worry much about. It was reliable, replaced a lot of the criticism people had with the British roadsters of the time for a much more affordable cost. So the first generation Miata is just kind of the classic Miata, the styling that everyone recognizes. Some people don't like the styling. I think it's really cool. I like the pop-up headlights, and everything's not too aggressive, just a very charming look. And so the first generation definitely is appealing for that reason. Beyond that, you can find some really good deals on some used first-generation Miatas, as long as you find one that is been kept up pretty well and that doesn't have any rust. Rust is a big issue on Miatas that you got to look out for. You can get a really nice car without worrying too much about mileage, because they just go for so long and they have so few issues that as long as it's been kept up well, high mileage cars, not as much of an issue to worry about with Miatas, which is nice. So if you are considering the first generation NA Miata, it's a really good choice, but I would just suggest to stay away from the first cycle of those cars, and that's from 1990 up to 93 was kind of the first generation of the first generation, you could say. They call that the NA6 specifically, and the reason why they call it the NA6 is because it had a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder motor, very small. Only produced a little over 100 horsepower, I believe. Don't have the specific numbers. But, really not much power at all. Really light, really simple. Not much structural rigidity, not much protection from anything. Just really bare bones. And they're not too much cheaper than the second refresh of the first generation. So for that reason, they're still great cars, but I would not recommend getting one unless you really can't find the second refresh of the first generation car. Speaking of that, that's called the NA8, and that's from 94 to 97, and it's codenamed NA8 because it has a 1.8 liter instead of 1.6 motor, which, you know, is of course not a drastic difference. Neither of these had very much power, but it's more about the other differences that this car brought through this mid-cycle refresh. There were some chassis improvements. It was stiffer. You should get better wheel and tire options, better suspension options from the factory, as well as just being a little bit more of a newer car overall, and some electronics and specifics about the car that were just a little bit more well sorted after the initial very first Miatas from 1990 to 93. So the first generation cars are really great, and I would just say really consider looking at the 1.8 model cars, 1.8 liter engine cars, that is, from 94 to 97. Now let's talk about special editions within the first generation, or any sort of limited run cars they did. They did do a fair amount of those, and the most noteworthy ones are the M Edition Miatas and the R Package models. And like I said at the beginning of this video, you know, none of these cars are so drastically different that you're going to really regret buying one over the other, but there are some subtle and noticeable differences between the models that are worth noting. So the most known variation of the Miata is the M Edition, which is kind of like a higher trim level of the Miata. So, you know, for the years that they made them, which was 94 to 97, here's another reason why the NA8 is a better car than the NA6, because they made these M Editions. But it was essentially just the highest trim level of the year that you could get. So it had, you know, leather interior, it had cruise control, it had AC, it had power steering, and it just had pretty much all the options that you could choose for that year. It had the limited slip differential, so that's a mechanical difference between that one and the regular Miata. So not a huge difference, but definitely a little bit. These are a little bit more sought after cars. They didn't make as many of them. They're a little bit more rare, came in special colors. So they're very nice cars as Miatas go. So they're really, if you can find one of those for a good price, I would say that's almost the best option within the first generation are these M Edition models. Another one is the R Package, and so if you think of the M Edition as more of the luxury-oriented, higher trim level, the R Package is more of like the sport package. But, you know, unlike modern sport package cars where they have, you know, adjustable shocks and damping and all sorts of newer technology that make them far sportier than the normal counterparts, the R Package was not a huge difference. It had, I think, slightly stiffer factory suspension, maybe slightly bigger wheels, and some aero, like a back spoiler, and it also had the limited slip differential, but it did not have any of the kind of luxury or convenience items on the inside. It had, you know, cloth seats, no AC, no ABS, I don't think any power steering, so it was definitely geared towards a certain audience, which I actually thought I was in this category, because, you know, it had pretty much all the options that you cared about for driving purposes, and then none of the ones that you needed for convenience sake. So it was really the driver-oriented model of the Miata. So that's what I was looking for a while, but they are hard to find, and people charge a premium because they're R-package cars. And I realized later that you can, with some simple modifications, or with some not spending a whole lot of money, you can make pretty much any Miata drive how you like, and you can make it up to spec of the R Package or significantly better. So unless you really care about the rarity factor or the specific parts that came in the R Package, I don't think it's really something you need to look for specifically. So enough about the first generation. Let's talk about the second generation a little bit, which is actually not that much different than the first generation mechanically, and that is, as you might know, that is my car. I have a 2000 Mazda Miata, so that's from the second generation. And similar to the first, they had a mid-cycle refresh in 2000, and so they had two kind of different sub-generations of this car. And the first being from 1999 to 2000, and then the second refresh was from 2001 to 2005. And so these are, like the first generation, not big differences between them, but definitely noticeable, and one of the reasons I actually opted for this one, the 2000. So I'll first talk about the differences between these two generations, sub-generations, because the actual car itself is very similar to the first generation in a lot of ways. Shares the same engine, shares the same chassis, shares a lot of the same mechanical parts, and it's just a little bit more updated in terms of its styling and its interior, but the actual mechanical elements of the car are very similar. So the first couple years of the NB, the 99 and 2000, had slightly different styling than the second generation of the NB. These are kind of codenamed NB1 and NB2. So in the first generation of the NB, the interior was kind of more, not simplistic, but just classic Miata as opposed to newer Mazda design language. So if you look at the 2001 to 2005 cars, the interior kind of matches the rest of the cars they were making at the time. It has a big Mazda logo, a lot of standard Mazda parts, and I don't think it looks quite as special as a Miata, really, and it just looks kind of like any Mazda. So the interior, definitely some people like it because it's newer, so it's a little bit more modern than the NB1 cars, but I actually don't think it looks as nice as the NB1 cars, just because it's a little bit, I don't know, it's not as classic Miata. So the exterior styling was also a difference between the NB1 and NB2 cars. The NB1 were a little bit softer lines, not big changes, but the NB2, the lights were a little bit more angular, not angular, but they came to a bit more of a point. There were, I think, slightly bigger factory wheel options. You could get a 16 instead of a 15-inch wheel. There was a little bit more of an aggressive aero, but really not much, and the styling is just kind of up to preference, whether you think it looked better in its first couple of years or in the 01 to 05 years. So I happen to think that the first couple of years of the NB looked better. Again, one of the reasons why I got this car, but they're not big differences. And then perhaps the biggest, or one of the more major considerations for thinking about the first and second sub-generations of the NB Miata is the engine itself. And it's the same engine at its core, but they did add variable valve timing for the second refresh of this car, which did not mean too much for performance. I think the car made a few more horsepower, but really pretty much the same performance, and all it meant is that the car now needed premium fuel and it had a few more complex parts to it. So it's just a little bit more of a complicated engine, a little bit more going on, needs premium fuel. Some of the parts you buy when you buy aftermarket parts have to be different for the first generation, first and second sub models, I would say, between the NB. So it's kind of a personal preference between the NB1 and 2. Both of them are great cars, and again, as with a lot of these Miata differences, it'll mostly more come down to just what car you find, if it's a good deal, if it's been maintained well, and if you find one like that, then it matters less about what specific car it is, and more about just the shape it's in and whether it's one you like. But there are some differences between the NB cars, and that's what I wanted to point out. And in terms of special editions or limited run cars for the second generation, there are some. I think they made some special editions most years of the second generation that had a special edition model. This is one of them, so this is the 2000 year special edition, which I really like. Again, it wasn't something that I was specifically looking for or had to have when I was looking for the car, but I really appreciate this car. I love the color. It's a one-off color. It's called Mahogany Mica, which is, a very pretentious name for purple or burgundy, but, it's a really nice color that most Miatas weren't. It has all the interior options that you could want: cruise control, power steering, air conditioning, Bose speakers, really nice tan. The whole design of the interior is very nice and feels pretty premium and upscale for a Miata, so I really like that. It has a limited slip differential. This one actually has a 6-speed gearbox. And this 6-speed transmission became standard, I believe, in 2001 for the NB2 cars, but it was only in this special edition for 2000. So the mechanical differences between this and the regular car are pretty much just the limited slip differential and the gearbox. But those, are pretty major things, so I'm really happy with this car. And so they had some special editions from other years as well, kind of similar things, small differences, and mostly just the rarity factor. They only made a few thousand of each, and that's why people want them. The one other special edition Miata that is well known within the community is the Mazda Speed Miata, which they only made from 2004 to 2005. I believe they only made a few thousand of them, and this one gets all of its all of its torque because it has a turbocharger on it from the factory. And you know, it's not a big turbo, it doesn't produce a lot of power, it produces about 180 horsepower instead of 140, which is what the stock ones, the naturally aspirated cars made. So not a huge difference, but it did provide a platform for tuners, anyone aftermarket, to get a lot out of this car. And so the Mazda Speed Miata is a very sought after car because it's the only Miata to date that's come from the factory with a turbo on it. And so, you know, it's because it's still such a light car, it's significantly faster, provides a lot of performance improvements over the stock Miata. So they're great cars, they're really cool and more rare, but they are a lot more expensive. So if you really want one, go for it. I don't think you'll regret it, but if you don't care as much about outright speed, which is, you know, not what the Miata is about anyway, then sticking to any of the regular Miatas will be totally fine for most people. You know, when I was looking for a car, I had those things in mind about all the differences, because I had done some research, but none of them, or most of them, weren't really factors that were going to sway me away from buying a particular car or another. Again, it really just comes down to specific cars you find, whether they're in good shape, if it's one that you're really drawn to, if it's a color you want, if it's if it has some certain option or features that you want, and really just case-by-case basis is the best way to look at these cars because they are so similar. So I just wanted to go over all the differences between the cars, but really it comes down to just your preference and driving some, see how you like them, and just go from there because they're all great cars and you can't really go wrong with any of them. Sorry I didn't really cover anything past 2005. The NC cars are a little newer, not as simple, and more modern cars and more expensive, and so I don't really know much about them because I was not considering that as one of the cars to buy. So overall, I'd say pretty much the biggest decision you want to make is between the first and second generations, and it will come down to, you know, which one you can find for a good price, if you like the styling more of the original Miatas, if you care about that slightly nicer interior you get in the second generation. If you want a 6-speed transmission, those are available in the second generation. And really, a lot of these things did appeal to me, and it's why I decided to buy the car I did. I really love the first generation Miata, still do a lot, but in terms of value for money and what kind of car you can get and age and miles and features, the second generation just really made a lot of sense to me, and that's why I ended up going with this car. Anyway, this video probably went way too long. I went into more details than I intended. There's probably still more details to talk about. But bottom line is most Miatas are going to be great buys as long as you find one that's in good shape and it's been maintained well. And so just the years to avoid, I would say, are the really early ones, 90 to 93. And then if you don't want to have to put premium fuel in your car, maybe 01 to 05, don't look at those as well. But in general, you know, just go drive one, see how you like it, and see what works for you. That's how I found this one. Anyway, if you have any questions, you leave them in the comments below. There's probably some more details that I could provide if anyone cares. But as always, this has been Cars and Kelley. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.